you're like, that represents everybody. But okay, I'm not saying anybody like this, like a dog, like, oh. So, let's see. All right, so there are three approaches that people take when they're trying to treat depression and anxiety. One is physical health. And these are the blanks on your sheet, I believe. Before we dive into this, I did just want to say real quick that the complexities that we talked about, depression and anxiety, how they can cause each other, how physical and spiritual, all of that, I know that's really complicated. I know that's hard to hold in your head. That is why the flowchart exists. And I promise you that if you stare at it long enough, you might start to understand it better. But in all seriousness, that is what the flowchart is for. If you're struggling to grasp all of that, try to follow the arrows and just and maybe even come up with imaginary cases on your own. It could be really helpful in terms of understanding it. All right. So one is physical health, another is spiritual health, and a third and recently constructed way is called mental health. Now, it might sound strange for a retreat that's on depression and anxiety, but we're not going to talk about mental health very much. And the reason for this is that the practice is fraught with error because it is based on, and it begins with, a flawed and contra-biblical premise. Now, as a disclaimer, before I start talking about this and explaining what I mean by that, I want to mention that a lot of what I'm going to say about this category of mental health comes from Jay Adams, whose books are heavily used in counseling courses at our denomination seminary. So I'm not coming out of left field, even though it might seem that way. And I also want to say that if you are seeing someone for mental health or mental illness, I am emphatically not telling you to stop going to see that person or to ignore their advice. I'll get into advice for using the information that I'm about to provide in a minute, but I just want you to know at the outset I'm not telling you to stop seeing your therapist. The rise of atheism has caused a lot of philosophical problems. It used to be the case that how people think and how people feel was a branch of philosophy. It was something that was discussed in philosophy textbooks. And this is because it was assumed, it was just assumed by everybody, that there is an immaterial part of man, a soul. And atheism, generally speaking, flat out denies the existence of the human soul. For the atheist, usually, the only thing that there is the physical. We are just, I think Jeff Durbin likes to put it, we're just fizzing chemicals. He says that to make fun of atheists. Anyway, and I don't necessarily endorse everything he says, but I think calling people fizzing chemicals is funny. Let's see. But of course, people do think and people do feel, and those feelings and those thoughts have to take place somewhere. And since people, from an atheistic perspective, are only physical, it was sort of decided by consensus. That's an oversimplification, but it's as deep as we need to go here. It was sort of decided by consensus that the people who suffer from problems in their thinking, problems in their feeling, and or problems in how they will, their volition, people who suffer from problems there should receive help from experts in the body, since that's all that there is. If you're sad all the time, it must be because there's something wrong with your brain. But of course, that doesn't work. Sometimes, and often even, when people have problems with how they think, how they will, or how they feel, no physiological cause can be found. There's nothing wrong with your brain, your hormones, your electrolytes, etc. You're just sad, or you're just anxious. And this has led to the creation through Sigmund Freud, and men like him, of another category of what's called mental health or mental illness. Two sides of the same coin. When therapists, psychologists, and psychiatrists talk about mental health, they are talking about patterns of thought, patterns of willing, and patterns of feeling that affect how we will think, will, and feel in the future. And if this sounds like the kind of thing that pastors and biblical counselors do in their counseling, it's because it is. When men like Freud talk about the mind and mental health, they are talking about the soul. But because they don't believe in the soul, sorry, that's not what my notes say. But they don't believe in the soul because that's silly, because souls don't exist, they say. And so they talk about the mind. And the mind, they say, is something that can really only be treated by experts. And so this is a little bit like if you wanted to discredit car mechanics and take over their job. An approach that you might take is to first first tell people that cars don't really exist. Cars are not a thing. You're ridiculous for thinking that cars are a thing. What happens is we all get into magical boxes, and they take us magically to our destination. You might tell people that. And if you could get people to believe that, if you could get people to believe that cars don't exist and instead we have magical boxes, and you get them used to that idea, then you could suggest that the mechanics who work on them, are really quite silly. They don't know what they're doing because they believe in cars. And how can you treat a magical box if you think it's a car and cars don't exist? Really, people should only trust their magical box with those who start from the solid foundation that there's no such thing as a car. Someone who's not silly. Someone who's credible. So stop going to your mechanic because he works on cars and those don't exist. Instead, come to us, come to our shop where we can fix your magical box. That's an approach that you might take. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying that modern therapy and modern psychology invented atheism in order to take a job that previously belonged to pastors. That's not what I'm saying at all. And frankly, you couldn't even make that case. It would be wrong to say that, for one thing, because the Ninth Commandment forbids us from trying to import motive to people like that. But then it's also just historically not the case. Atheism antedated Freud and all of that. So, predated Freud. Let's see. So things have not developed that intentionally, but the result has been similar to if it was intentional. So people now, many people in our culture, dismiss pastors and the counseling work that they do because pastors believe in a soul. And of course, no credible person, no smart intellectual person believes in a soul. And so they instead turn to atheistic experts who claim that while you don't have a soul, you do have a mind. You have mental health. But those people could not really begin to explain what the mind is without using language that we would use about the soul. And that's what I mean by the car analogy. It's this weird problem where they need to have this non-physical category, but they can't let it be spiritual because then God exists. Anyway, it's a whole thing. Now, of course, if you don't believe in cars and you try to fix one, you're going to be fighting an uphill battle. But if you bang a wrench enough places on enough cars, eventually you'll probably fix one, even if your presuppositions made it incredibly unlikely. So, also, sometimes therapists and psychologists and psychiatrists do have some success. And they've been doing it for long enough now that they actually have found a lot of things that provide success. So to be clear, I'm not saying that psychiatry is a completely invalid science, but I am saying that psychiatry should concern itself with the physical and leave matters of the soul, our thoughts, our wills, and our affection to spiritual leaders and pastors and elders. To spiritual leaders who are pastors and elders. Jay Adams articulates what I'm saying in the following quote from his Christian Counselor's Manual. This is a tough quote, so I'm going to explain it as I go through. But Jay Adams starts out by saying that there is much for the psychiatrist to do medically to help persons suffering from problems in living whose etiology or origin is organic or physical, can't be questioned. So he's saying it's without question that psychiatrists can really help us with problems, like counseling problems, where the source of the problem is physical. That's beyond questioning. They absolutely can. They should be working on that. He says the field is growing. Certainly an understanding of the influence of bodily chemistry upon behavior and emotions is only beginning. So the understanding that we have as a society of how our bodies affect how we feel and how we think, that's only beginning. We're just getting started on that. For instance, recent studies indicate that those pathological problems that result from toxic chemical impact upon perception and consequently on personality are probably greater in number than is presently known. Man, Jay Adams knows how to make a sentence. What he's saying there is that there is study right now happening on how toxic chemicals can affect our brain and thereby affect how we see things, how we hear things, and then in turn affect our actions, our wills, our minds, and our affections. And he's saying that we probably don't even understand even a quarter of all the ways that can be happening to us. And so he says that the Christian pastor would rejoice to see psychiatry leave the area of the non-organic or the non-physical to become what, in America though not in Europe, it falsely claimed to be, a medical specialty. In other words, psychiatry's legitimate function is to serve those who suffer from organic or physical difficulties. The psychiatrist has reason for existence only when he specializes as a physician to treat medically those persons whose problems have an organic or physical etiology or cause. So the legitimate sphere for psychiatrists to operate in is helping you understand what's wrong with your body and how it's affecting your feelings, your will, and your thinking, and helping you treat that. Even then, though, even if psychiatrists stuck to that, there would likely be need for twofold help. While the physician treats the physical problem, the Christian counselor should pedal in tandem as he works with the physician who treats... I'm going to fix that. As he works with the physician who treats the ulcer, so a physician, he's describing an example. As he works with a physician who treats an ulcer by dealing with the life patterns that led to the ulcer, so he may need to work together with a physician using megavitamin therapy. So somebody who's really stressed and has developed some kind of an ulcer as a result of that stress might need to work with their pastor to understand all the simple patterns of anxious thought that led to that ulcer. But at the same time, he might also need to start taking supplements and mega-dosing vitamins because a physician tells him that he has, for example, like we talked about, a magnesium deficiency. So the pastor's task will be to help him to alter simple life patterns that may have developed in response to the chemical disorder. And these may include bad human relationships resulting from suspicion, withdrawal from others, etc. So basically, Adams is saying that psychiatry is very valuable when it seeks to understand, to study, and to treat physical problems. Mental health, or soul health, however, is best done by those whom Scripture commands to engage in the task, pastors and elders, and in a less formal way, fellow believers working from the solid foundation of the Scriptures. So to be clear, I'm trying to explain why a lot of what you might think to call mental health is really soul health or spiritual health. I'm making the case for valuing what the Bible has to say about our immaterial part, about how our immaterial part affects our thoughts, wills, and affections far, far more than those who claim to be experts in something they profess not to believe in. Now, if you're seeing an unbelieving therapist or some other kind of professional, psychologist, psychiatrist, who is not a believer, I'm not telling you to stop, or even to tell your parents that you want to stop. What I am saying is that we need to be careful with their advice. And I would absolutely encourage you, if you are seeing someone like that, to also be talking about the advice and the thoughts that you're getting from that person with an elder or a pastor and your parents. Because they're operating from a dangerous premise. And the advice that they're giving you is not just mental advice, it's soul advice. Now, if you're seeing a Christian therapist or other kind of professional, then I'm also not telling you to stop, but you should be aware that for a lot of Christian therapists, they're having to fight against a lot of the premises and pieces of advice that they received on how to help you in their training. And they may be fighting an uphill battle if they start from the premise that modern study of mental health has more to say about our problems than the Bible does. But my advice is the same. If you aren't already, just make sure you're discussing any counsel that you get from them with your elders and your parents. So having said all of that, let's talk about how to pursue the physical health angle in an attempt to treat depression and anxiety. Then we'll talk about the spiritual approach. Are there any questions about mental health before we move on? Did all of that make sense? Cool. So the first thing I want to say about physical health is that I'm not a doctor. Your parents probably are not doctors. Your pastors and elders, probably not doctors. And lots of people want to give medical advice that is way above their pay grade, and I'm not trying to do that here. Medical issues should be pursued with medical professionals. That being said, there are some basic being a person things that you should do and make sure you're doing before you spend thousands of dollars on medical professionals. And by this I mean, for example, if you're tired all the time and you sometimes doze off in the middle of the day, you should probably make sure that you're not staying up until 3 a.m. playing Fortnite. You don't need to pay a doctor lots and lots of money to tell you, hey, maybe sleep. And then before we dive in here, I also do just want to demonstrate from the Bible why it is good and acceptable to pursue the medical route when we have problems with things like depression or anxiety. So in 1 Kings 19, after Elijah has slain all the prophets of Baal with a sword, he hears that Jezebel is looking to kill him. So he runs away about a day's journey into the wilderness. He sits down under a tree and he asks for God to kill him. And he says, "It is enough now, O Lord, take away my life, for I am not better than my fathers." Now, Elijah is definitely acting sinful here. He has let fear and discouragement overwhelm him and drive him to despair even of life itself. But God does not note in this passage, you can look it up during the break or devotions tomorrow, in this passage, God does not start by rebuking Elijah. The first thing that he does is he sends an angel to give Elijah food and water and a good night's sleep. The guy had just been running through the wilderness for a full day. And so God first sends an angel, first takes care of his body, and then he starts rebuking and correcting Elijah. So that's the part that we're talking about right now. We're talking about how we can treat the body. So I haven't mentioned this before, but I, about 12-ish years ago, really struggled hard with depression and anxiety. And when I was struggling really hard with depression and anxiety, I was aiming to get about 5 hours of sleep. Like, aiming to get that. Like, that was my goal. If I can hit 5, I'll feel good. Then I thought, I can get by on just 5 hours of sleep because I'm getting good grades in college, and so this is all the sleep that I need. But I was a depressed and anxious mess. Anxious thoughts and feelings of worthlessness attacked from all sides, and I didn't know how to fight them off. When, at the advice of a pastor actually, I started aiming to get about 8.5 hours of sleep instead of 5, it was like the difference between having a sword and not having a sword when someone is attacking you with a sword. Don't get me wrong, I am not good with a sword, but when someone's attacking me with a sword, I'm way worse without a sword. And you young people, you might think you're young and practically invincible, but young people actually need more sleep, not less. So maybe that's all you need right now, is just a reminder that you need to get sleep, especially on a retreat. And if you feel like you are too busy to get 8 hours of sleep, I would seriously recommend talking with your pastor about that. Talking with your parents about that. And if you're a grown adult and you don't want to talk to your parents, maybe talk to your pastor about that then. Next up is diet. And I know what you're thinking, right? You're all thinking, this guy seems so smart. How could he be so dumb to think that he only needed 5 hours of sleep? I know none of you are really thinking that. But this was 12 years ago, and believe it or not, 12 years ago, I was dumber still. I'm over 6 feet tall. I technically need to eat close to 3,000 calories a day in order to avoid losing weight. And 12 years ago, I was eating about half of that. I was around 120 pounds. At the advice of some friends, I started eating more, and slowly but surely that also helped me feel better. And also, I didn't eat junk food. I ate lots of meat and vegetables and complex carbs. This isn't a giant lecture on some crazy new diet where you're going to feel amazing by cutting out gluten. I didn't do that. I didn't do any of the crazy diets. I just started eating like a civilized human being, and a tall one at that. Also, at the time, I was working a desk job, and I got very little physical activity, and I found that going for just 1 or 2 20-minute walks a day was incredibly helpful. It doesn't need to be complicated, but if you're completely sedentary or stationary, sitting still for most of the day, that will affect your body and your soul. Your body will start telling you something's wrong, and your soul will usually start to feel as sluggish as your body actually is. Also during this time, I was living in the Pacific Northwest, where we get about 8 hours of sunlight during the winter, during the day. So I would go to work in the dark, and I would come home in the dark. And so I found that timing my breaks during the day and going for walks on those breaks meant that I could at the same time get exercise and sunlight. People are not designed to be inside all day, and one of the main ways that we get vitamin D is through our eyes and skin absorbing sunlight. And when I got blood work a few years later, it turned out that I had a vitamin D deficiency, which, go figure, can cause depression and anxiety. So that's pretty much the basics of just how to be a person, how to take reasonable care of your body. If you're neglecting any of these and you're suffering from depression or anxiety, maybe try correcting them, because you might be surprised how much it helps. So it's important, this is the blanks I believe, it's important to make sure that we are eating healthy, that we are getting enough sleep, enough exercise, and enough sunlight. Any questions on that?
What was the second blank?
The second blank, so eating healthy and then getting enough sleep, exercise, and sunlight. Anything else?
Do you have any points on how that ties in with like the Sabbath as far as rest?
Yeah, that's a complicated question. It is okay 1 day a week to not get exercise, but it's also...
In the general concept of rest, not specifically with exercise.
Oh, I see what you're talking about. Well, let me finish the answer to the question I thought you were asking real quick, just to finish the sentence. It is okay to not exercise one day a week, but it's also okay to do something like go for a walk, listen to a sermon, pray. Like just even a 15-minute prayer walk can be really helpful on the Sabbath. As Christians, the Sabbath is the way that we commune with God, our Maker. Augustine said, "You have made us for yourself, and our hearts are restless until we find you, until we find rest in you." And so it just is the case that taking the time to spend all day, every Lord's Day, with Jesus is incredibly helpful. That's not physical rest so much. Often we find that we're busier and more active in a sense on the Lord's Day than we are any other day of the week because I work a sitting job. But yeah, I think it is super important. And that's really, we'll talk about stuff like that when we talk about the spiritual angle of things. Is that helpful? Anything else? Go ahead.
Do you feel confident looking back when those things you listed were the root of that struggle, or do you feel that they were just kind of a boost to people at home?
I think that I was being assaulted on both sides. I think that it was a both-end situation. I had a lot of simple patterns of thought, specifically about feeling worthless, feeling like I am a useless person who doesn't contribute, and then also feeling like I couldn't do anything. Issues surrounding a basic sense that I can be competent to do things. So I had that, and then it's like somebody put that in a Molotov cocktail, which is a thing that people use to burn things down, and then threw it at the window of my soul. Anybody else? Cool. Let's see. One other physical thing that you can do at home is a breathing exercise. There's a bunch of different breathing exercises. Frankly, if you Google them, all of them are fine. Just if you start to feel lightheaded, you're probably doing it wrong, or you're reading like a prank blog. I don't know. But the one I'm going to tell you about should not result in this. And human beings have this thing called a vagus nerve that governs a lot of how our nervous system feels in response to stress. Breathing in fully, like all the way, holding for 4 or 5 seconds, then breathing out fully all the way, like to the point where you kind of feel it like in your stomach. Breathing out fully all the way, holding that for 4 seconds, and then repeating that for a minute or 2 or even 5 can often reduce the feeling of anxiety you're experiencing by stimulating the vagus nerve and helping your body respond more calmly. Another thing that you can do is just pausing to think about and notice your surroundings. One reason that people get motion sickness is because our inner ears tell our body things like how fast we're going, how high up we are, whether we're turning left or right, whether we're upside down. That's what our inner ears do. And one reason people get motion sickness is because what their inner ear is telling them is contrary to what their eyes are telling them. So you're sitting in the back of the car and you're reading a book while you're driving. And your inner ear is saying, all right, we're accelerating and we're turning left. And your eyes are like, I don't see anything moving. And your brain goes, what do we do? I'm going to throw up so we can run away. Because throwing up does help you run away. You've got less weight. At least that's the theory. Similarly, our body, it's just so we're clear, if any of you are in track, do not take that as advice. I'm sorry. Similarly, though, our body likes to know what's going on around us. And sometimes we get so caught up in our thoughts that we lose track of what's going on around us, and this can make us feel unsafe, and it can aggravate our body's stress response. So thinking about things like what do you see? What does the air feel like? What do your clothes feel like? What things are you hearing? What does the seat you're sitting in feel like? Those can feed your body's desire to know what's going on. They can also take your mind off of whatever's stressing you, and overall it can just help you calm down a bit. And both of these exercises, and also going for a short walk, can be extremely valuable during a panic attack. Now, having said all of that, if you find that basic being a reasonable human stuff is not solving your problem, or if you're finding that you need to use the exercises that I just mentioned frequently, then it's probably a good idea to see a doctor. Psychiatrists, okay? Psychiatrists are people who are trained. So, actually, let me break this down. Therapists are people who have a master's degree. So, they have a master's degree in trying to help people with mental health issues. Psychologists are people who have a doctorate in trying to help people with their mental health. And psychiatrists are people who have a physician's degree, a physician, like a doctorate as a physician, and they are empowered to write prescriptions for things like antidepressants and anti-anxiety medications, and balancing those things in a person is one of the specialties of psychiatry. So a lot of people, when they're like, there might be something wrong with my body, they'll start by going to a psychiatrist. But I would actually counsel you to start with a family doctor or a general practitioner, the same doctor that you go to when you get the sniffles. Let me explain why. Antidepressants and anti-anxiety medications are things that are generally used to treat symptoms, not causes. They intentionally act on the parts of the body that control things like sadness or anxiety. So, for example, anti-anxiety medications legitimately suppress your body's ability to have a stress response. They typically do this either by flooding your body with an anti-stress hormone like GABA or serotonin, or they do it by suppressing the parts of your body that receive stress hormones. That is, they make it so that your body, the things your body releases to tell you something's wrong, they're not actually received by your brain, so you never get that signal. And sometimes, to be honest, that's what you need. But far more often, your body is telling you something is wrong because something is actually wrong. Common causes of anxiety and depression include things like lack of B vitamins, lack of magnesium, lack of vitamin D, too much thyroid, too little thyroid, a brain tumor, lack of sleep, poor diet. When anti-anxiety medications and antidepressants are used, they can mask one of your body's main ways of telling you that something is wrong. So a lack of vitamin C can actually make you feel very, very sad. And if it's left untreated, it will turn into something called scurvy, which is a more severe and dangerous condition. But if you immediately jump to seeing a psychiatrist and they prescribe you an antidepressant without doing basic tests like blood work, your small problem can grow much bigger because your body was trying to tell you something was wrong, and instead of investigating what might be wrong, you took a pill that said, "Shut up, body." So while we need to trust the experts, and we were just talking about this, while we need to trust the experts, we also need to strive to understand what's going on. We don't trust pastors with an implicit faith because they're pastors. I'm going to skip through this, actually, because we just talked about this. Basically, we need to understand what's wrong, truly wrong, not just at a symptom level, but at a cause level. And we need to understand what then is going to be done to treat it. General practitioners and family doctors are more broad-minded in terms of understanding what's wrong with you. So starting with them and just asking, say, hey, I've been feeling a little bit off, and obviously you're doing this through your parents if you're under 18. But talking to your doctor and saying, hey, I've been feeling kind of off. It's been a while since I've had a physical. Can we just do a physical and blood test, just make sure everything's going well? Usually they'll be happy to do that. And that's considered preventative care, so it's usually pretty cheap for your insurance. But starting there can honestly be far more helpful than going straight to a psychiatrist or even telling your general practitioner, I think I'm depressed. Not that you shouldn't tell your general practitioner that you think you're depressed, but maybe start by just asking for a checkup, asking for a physical, asking for blood work to make sure that he follows this particular route. So starting there can often be more helpful than going to a psychiatrist because psychiatrists are usually pretty quick on the trigger when it comes to prescribing antidepressants and anti-anxiety medications. So to be clear, I'm not saying that antidepressants and anti-anxiety medications are bad. Sometimes they are exactly what you need. Some conditions legitimately require them. And there are some times when doctors just can't figure out what's going on. And so the only thing to do is to use an anti-anxiety medication or an antidepressant. But we should try to work with a doctor with more broad experience and training before we pursue the narrow route of psychiatric medications. Does that make sense to everybody? Cool. This all raises the question, though, of when to pursue medical solutions instead of just spiritual ones. First, I want to say at the outset, I think it's a good practice to do things like physical and blood work on some kind of regular basis. I actually have a doctor who likes to point out that we have our teeth, which we can see, examined every 6 months. But most people can't remember the last time they had their blood examined, which they can't see, or at least shouldn't see. It's supposed to be on the inside. So there's never any harm in talking to a doctor if you have the means and the time, even if you're not struggling from depression and anxiety. Just going in and being like, hey, you think I'm healthy? That can be really valuable. And then it's certainly good to talk to your doctor, even if you just have mild depression or anxiety. I'm very pro-doctor in that way. If you have the means and you have the money, you have the time, just go. Having said all of that, I think when you talk with a pastor or an elder about your depression or your anxiety, and you've thought and prayed and pursued spiritual means, and your pastor and elder really think that you're doing everything well, and you think you're doing everything well, and you think that you're handling things biblically, and your pastor or your elder thinks that you're handling things biblically, but the problem won't go away, that is a really good time to pursue earnestly the possibility of a medical cause. Just remember that in most cases, addressing the medical is only half the thing. People under these kinds of medical conditions will usually build up simple patterns and habits with that medical condition that will cause even greater depression and anxiety. And just treating the one half of the human, the one part of the human, usually won't completely resolve it. You'll usually need to treat both. Is all of that clear? Just saw like 15 people shake their head. No, I'm just kidding. So that brings us to the topic of how we can treat depression and anxiety from a spiritual angle. How much time do we have? Okay. First thing we're going to do is look at a case study in Psalm 42 of a man who seemed to struggle with both of these things. Then we'll draw a few principles from that study and apply them. Camden, would you like to read Psalm 42, including the superscription? Something fun up here is you get to pick on people. And if you've never picked on Camden, it's really fun. It's going to take you a full minute to find it? Bro.
As the deer pants for flowing streams, so pants my soul for you, O God. My soul thirsts for God, for the living God. When shall I come and appear before God? My tears have been my food day and night. All they say to me all the day long, where is your God? These things I remember as I pour out my soul. How I would go with the throng and lead them in procession to the house of God, with glad shouts and praise songs of praise, a multitude keeping festivals. Why are you cast down, O my soul? And why are you in turmoil within me? Hope in God, for I shall again praise him, my salvation and my God. My soul is cast down within me. Therefore, I remember you from the land of Jordan and Hermon and Mount Mizar. Deep calls to deep at the roar of your waterfalls. All your breakers and your waves have gone over me. By day the Lord commands his steadfast love, and at night his song is with me, a prayer to the God of my life. I say to God, my rock, why have you forgotten me? Why do I go mourning because of the oppression of the enemy? As with a deadly wound in my bones, my adversaries taunt me, while they say to me all the day long, where is your God? Why are you cast down, O my soul? And why are you in turmoil within me? Hope in God, for I shall again praise him, my salvation and my God.
All right. And the superscription here in the NKJV, which is what I'll be working from if anybody's confused by why the words are different, it reads, to the chief musician, a contemplation of the sons of Korah. So we're supposed to have lunch at 12:15, right? Cool. I will basically just cut off, not in the middle of a verse, but finish a verse when we get there. We might not finish all of this in this lecture, but that's okay. The plan was go through all of Psalm 42 in this lecture and then kind of reflect on it and talk more deeply about spiritual causes in the next one. We might cover just a little bit of Psalm 42 in the next lecture because I don't want your food to get cold. Am I not merciful? That's a Gladiator reference. Okay, so Psalm 42. The superscription reads, to the chief musician. By the way, superscription, your Bible probably has it in all caps. That's actually divinely inspired. There might also be another title at the top there, like mine says, yearning for God in the midst of distress. That's added by the translators. But the superscription, the thing in like small caps, that's actual scripture. It just doesn't have a verse number. Okay. So that will read in the NKJV anyway, to the chief musician, a contemplation of the sons of Korah. The word contemplation there can also mean wisdom or understanding. So all psalms obviously have wisdom, but this title here means that there are uncommon depths of wisdom to be mined through contemplating this psalm. Now, when we read this of the sons of Korah, this is a little bit confusing because the sons of Korah are priests and Levites. They're those whom David appointed to be singers in the tabernacle. And when this psalm was written, these men would have numbered in the thousands. It's highly unlikely that thousands of men got together to write a song. You've probably had, if you've ever written a song, you probably know that even having 5 people can be really difficult. When we speak of the sword of King Arthur, it's understood that we mean the sword that King Arthur owned and used, not the sword that King Arthur forged. And the same can work in Hebrew. It's therefore reasonable to read this as a psalm for the sons of Korah. And that's actually how some translators choose to render it. So I'm going to suggest actually, and this is a fairly, I'm going to suggest that King David, wrote this psalm. There are quite a few psalms where we know that he wrote them, but it doesn't say so in the superscription. So that's one reason why it's reasonable to think this. But it's also a common Reformed interpretation that David wrote this psalm while he was on the run from his son Absalom. And that's because the style matches David's, and because the depictions of the circumstances in the psalm seem to line up quite readily with David's experience at the time. So we're going to be dealing with this psalm under the assumption that David wrote it while he was on the run from Absalom, because it's quite likely, and because if nothing else, it's important that we have a grounding for the outcry in this psalm. See, when we don't know the background of a psalm, it's tempting to treat the psalm as a nothing psalm written by no one to whom nothing ever happened. We'll pick apart the grammar, we'll do our exegesis, we'll pick apart the argumentation, but if it's not grounded in human experience, our interpretation can lack heart. Because the Psalms are intended to be sung by the people of God in all ages, and we're to sing them with understanding of mind and affections. Applying them to our own circumstances where it's appropriate. So if you're not convinced that David wrote this psalm while he was on the run from Absalom, that's okay. But I'd ask if you bear with me in treating David's run from Absalom as kind of a case study, like we're applying the psalm to David's run from Absalom. It seems that it's definitely an appropriate case study for the application and understanding of this psalm. We good? Anybody want to fight me? Not physically. Okay, cool. Unless it's a shoulder fight. Now, let me give you some context. You're probably all familiar with David's sin with Bathsheba. He lusted after her, he committed adultery with her, and when she became pregnant, he had her husband killed to cover up the adultery. And later, the prophet Nathan comes to him and convicts him of both of these sins. Both of these sins are capital offenses. And when David's sin is brought to his attention, he genuinely repents. But Nathan tells him that while David is not going to die for his sin, the son that he conceived with Bathsheba would die. And also, Nathan tells him that the sword will not depart from his house, that he should expect violence and sexual sin, and even public sexual sin, to be abundantly present in his family. And that is exactly what happens. Later in David's life, his son rapes his daughter. Then another of his sons kills that son. Then the murderous son, Absalom, takes the throne of David and tries to kill David. The hearts of the men of Israel follow after that murderous son, Absalom, and David is betrayed by family and friends. And David is also cut off from his family and fearing for his life. But, somewhat surprisingly, assuming that David did write this psalm at this time, that is not what David is lamenting in this psalm. Look with me at verses 1 and 2. They read, "As the deer pants for the water brooks, so pants my soul for you, O God. My soul thirsts for God, for the living God. When shall I come and appear before God?" And David, I'm sure, misses his family. He's distraught about the betrayal. He's afraid that he might die. We could actually read some of him dealing with that in Psalm 55. But in this psalm, he's primarily concerned about his relationship with God, about his loss of God's comforting presence. Now, when we read the Psalms and other biblical poetry, we need to be careful. See, our culture is not really given to poetry, and what little we use of it is often just little cliches, like the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. But biblical poetry is much better thought out. It's designed to make you think, and it's designed to make you feel. So let's pause here a second and think about what David is saying. Given David's life as a shepherd and his experience as a warrior, let me back up. I want you to think about the thirstiest that you've ever been. you're probably, in thinking about that, falling far short of how thirsty most people in the ancient Near East have been at various times in their lives. Maybe you've gone a day or so without water, but odds are you've never been on the brink of death. Given David's life as a shepherd and his experience as a warrior and his 2 exiles, I think it's safe to say that he probably had to endure more thirst than pretty much anyone here, and probably a lot of people in the ancient Near East. But what's interesting is he doesn't say, God, I thirst for you, like that time when I was in the Dead Sea region 20 years ago. He actually reaches further. He reaches in his mind, to an animal that's known for being thirsty. He describes this thirst as a panting, a desperation so intense that it's affecting the animal's breathing. In his mind, he points to the deer, and he cries out, and he says, that's how I feel about you, God. Where have you gone? When will I appear before you again? Now, some expositors, when they deal with this passage, if they look at verse 4, where David describes going to the house of God, they read that, and they think the only reason that David misses God is because he can't go to the tabernacle. But I don't believe that's actually a satisfactory explanation, because David has spent a lot of his life on the run and away from the tabernacle, fighting in various battles. Some teachers will teach you that in the Old Testament, the people of God didn't have the Holy Spirit, and they'll teach you that the only way that people could meet with God was by going to God's house, the tabernacle and later the temple. But this understanding is false for many reasons. The most obvious of which is the fact that we see the people of God praying and communing with God throughout the Old Testament without having to go to God's house. We even see it in this psalm, right? The psalmist is lamenting to God the fact that he can't go to the temple. If you can't pray to God without being in the temple, then you can't pray to God about not being able to go to the temple. Doesn't make sense. See, we believe that in the Old Testament, the people of God did have the Holy Spirit. As Reformed people, we believe that they did have the Holy Spirit. We believe that they could go to God in private worship, in family worship, and in smaller assemblies throughout Israel, like synagogue worship. We also believe that they could also meet with God at his house. So, for sure, not being able to go to God's house would have been sad. And there are psalms where that's lamented, like Psalm 137, which we sang last night. But more is happening here. David not only lacks the ability to go to the house of God, he lacks the comforting presence of God in his soul. He feels like God has disappeared. And he is desperate for that comforting presence. Verse 3 reads, my tears have been my food day and night, while they continually say to me, where is your God? Again, I want to pause here and have us consider this metaphor. Rather than eating food, David is crying. Have you ever wept so much that you've lost your appetite? I have, and I find that this can happen either because you're so upset that food loses its appeal, or because your body is so agitated by your emotions that your stomach is upset. David's probably experiencing both of these here. See, the comforting presence of God is a great aid to our faith. And as I said before, it can make you feel like you can handle anything. Like maybe you're depressed, maybe you're anxious, but if you turn to the means of grace and you feel God's comforting presence, it doesn't make it all better, but it does make it bearable. But when you lack that comforting presence of God, especially when you lack it in the midst of affliction, you feel like you're hanging on by a thread. You have to walk by faith and not by sight or sound or feeling, because all of those aids have been taken away. You feel like a blind man clinging to someone's hand for guidance, and you're just worried, so worried that hand is going to disappear and you won't be able to find it again. And on top of that, in verse 3, David's enemies are also mocking him. They're asking him the very question that he's asking himself. Where's God? But they don't ask it in faith. They ask it to mock. They ask it to make him feel worse and to shake his already weakened confidence, and also to blaspheme God. Maybe you've been here, maybe with human enemies, or maybe with the fiery darts of the wicked one, planting doubts in your mind. Peter calls Satan our adversary. Verse 4. The psalmist continues. When I remember these things, I pour out my soul within me. For I used to go with the multitude. I went with them to the house of God with the voice of joy and praise, with a multitude that kept the pilgrim feast. This may go without saying, but souls are not liquid. Souls are not a substance to be poured out. And of course, this is a metaphor, but it goes against even how we would normally think of souls. When you think of souls, you think of a spirit. You think of something that we lift up to God. You think of a breath. They're not this amorphous liquid that we can pour out. But water always rushes to the lowest point. And so it is with David's soul. It cleaves to the dust. It clings to the ground. The two are so joined that when you look at the ground, you can't tell where soul ends and ground begins. And this outpouring that David talks about, it's twofold. It represents his sorrow, and it also represents his pouring out of his thoughts and all that he is to God. When David thinks about how he used to lead the people of God in worship, his soul is melted within him, and he pours out his trouble to God. He continues in verse 5. Why are you cast down, O my soul? And why are you disquieted within me? Hope in God, for I shall yet praise him for the help of his countenance. Now we come to that question, the question that this verse that is the basis of these lectures. The word, well, let me back up. Sorry. The psalmist here recognizes clearly the condition of his soul, and he asks himself questions about it. He challenges himself about it. He interrogates his soul. When he says, why are you cast down, that could also be rendered as bowed down. And if you think about it, bowed down, cast down, the word depression in English is a synonym for both of these things. It would be a legitimate way to translate it. Maybe not the most helpful way, but a legitimate way. David's soul is brought low. It's pressed down. And we've already spent a little bit of time on what that means in the last verse when we talked about it cleaving to the dust or clinging to the ground. But disquieted is interesting. David also seems to have this sense of anxiety, this agitatedness, this troubledness in his soul. He's not just sad. It's the case that the hair on the back of his soul's neck is standing up. There's tension in David's soul. And so he asks himself. He feels this way. He doesn't ignore it. He doesn't try to tell himself he shouldn't feel this way necessarily and just completely ignore it. He asks himself, why do I feel this way? He challenges himself. He says, I know that I will praise God. I know that I will eventually get to be with God. So soul, why are you downcast? Hope in God, soul. Why won't you hope? What is so wrong that you can't see through it to the things eternal that I know are true? He inquires of his soul, and he preaches to his soul. That's just some of your blanks there. Inquires of his soul, and he preaches to his soul. Though that might be for the next lecture, I'm not sure. And this help of God's countenance is what I'm talking about when I say God's comforting presence. He's telling himself that it might not feel like God's face is shining down upon him right now, but it eventually will, and he will praise God for it. It might be in this life, or it might be in eternity, but David will feel God's comforting presence again. But why, he inquires, won't his soul get in gear? He knows in his head what's true. Why can't he get his affections to follow suit? I think that's where we're going to end for right now, because I would like, before we jump into lunch discussion groups, which I think is what we're doing, before we do that, I would like to see if there's any questions so that you guys can be more effective in how you discuss things. So, questions? No questions. I'm either doing a really good job or a really bad job. All right. We are going to sing then, before we dismiss here. Let's see. Somebody knows what we're going to sing. I think it's 42D, right? 102A. Sorry. Oh, that was, yes. We can either do 42D or 102A, because we're off by one psalm now. Whatever, if you're comfortable with 42D, I prefer it, but if you're not, then we can do one. Cool. What's your number? 42D. 42D is in Delta.